You are a Russian soldier in World War II. Your country is invaded by the Germans. Nothing seems to be able to stop their advance. Friendly armored units are being decimated by German panzers and anti-tank guns. But recently, the Germans started calling a tank the Russischer Koloss, or Russian Colossus in English. It would be superseded by the Joseph Stalin tank and was outperformed by the T-34 tanks. But this tank could hold a German advance with the support of some infantry, even if there were only a couple to hold a point. I am talking about the Kliment Voroshilov heavy tank. My name is General History, and as I said, today we're looking at the KV tanks. Now a quick disclaimer. I have some problems with my voice. I think I'm starting to get a cold. A man flu. I'm getting the terrible disease of the man flu. I might even be under the weather for a couple of days. I hope that my vital body will get me through this, like the KV tank got Russia through the Second World War. The KV series of tanks were named after the Soviet defense commissar and politician Kliment Voroshilov and was used during the Second World War by the Red Army. The KV series were known for their heavy armor, especially during the early part of the war. In certain situations, a single KV1 or KV2 supported by infantry was capable of halting larger German formations. Due to their armament not being able to penetrate the KV tanks, German panzers were rarely used in this time of the war. The KV was practically immune to the 3.7 cm KWK-36 and the short-barreled 7.5 cm KWK-37, which was basically a howitzer. These guns were mounted on the Panzer IIIs and Panzer IVs respectively. The KV-1 could only be damaged by the 8.8 cm flak gun until more effective guns were developed. About 500 of the more than 22,000 tanks prior to Operation Barbarossa in the Soviet Army were of the KV type. During the progression of the war, it became apparent that the KV was too expensive to produce compared to a T-34 medium tank, which outperformed it in all practical respects. The roomier three-man turret of the KV-1 was the only advantage of the T-34-76, and later in the war, the KV was used as a base for the development of the IAAS series of heavy tanks named after Joseph Stalin. Soviet designers started drawing up new tanks after the disappointment of the multi-turreted T-35 heavy tank. The T-35 conformed to the 1920s notion of a breakthrough tank, considering it had very heavy firepower and good armor protection, but it had poor mobility. It was the Spanish Civil War that demonstrated the need for much heavier armor on tanks, and that seemed to be the main influence on Soviet tank design just prior to the World War II. Several competing designs were offered, and even more were drawn up prior to reaching prototype stage. All designs had heavy armor, torsion bar suspension, wide tracks, and were welded and cast construction. One of the competing designs was the SMK, which had two turrets, one with a 76.2mm and the other with a 45mm weapon. This tank was named the SMK after the assassinated Communist Party official Sergei Mironovich Kirov. German intelligence classified it as a T-35C, which led to the misunderstanding that the failed T-35 took part in the Russo-Finnish War. A second design was made, with only a single turret and more armor, which would become known as the KV. During the Russo-Finnish War, they tested both of the SMK designs and the third design, the T-100, which also featured two turrets, and it was found that the KV outperformed the SMK and T-100 tanks. The armor of the KV was highly resistant to Finnish anti-tank weapons, making it difficult to stop. An order was made for 50 KVs in 1939, but during the war the Soviets found it difficult to deal with concrete bunkers and made a request for a tank with a large howitzer. As a rush project to meet the request, a new turret with a howitzer was designed for the KV tanks. Initially known as Little Turret KV and Big Turret KV, the 76mm armored tank was redesignated as the KV1 heavy tank and the 152mm howitzer became known as the KV2 heavy artillery tank. The KV1 was 45 tons heavy, with a length of 6.75 meters and a width of 3.32. It was 2.71 meters high and was complemented with a crew of 5, the commander, gunner and loader in the turret, and a driver and radio operator and machine gunner in the forward compartments of the hull. The frontal armor was 90mm thick at its thickest, with the sides and rear 75 and 70mm thick respectively. It was armed with a 76.2mm M1941 ZIS-5 gun and either 3 or 4 DT machine guns. It had a 600 horsepower model V2 V12 diesel engine, giving it 13 horsepower per ton with a top speed of 35 km per hour and an operational range of 335 km. The KV2 was 7 tons heavier, coming in at 52 tons, being 20 centimeters longer at 6.95 meters and 50 centimeters higher at 3.25. The KV2 had one extra loader, giving it a crew of 6, and its armor ranged from 60 to 110 millimeters. It was armed with 2 DT machine guns, and it had a V2 K12 cylinder diesel engine with 550 horsepower, giving it 10.6 horsepower per ton, which amounted to a top speed of 28 km per hour and an operational range of 140 km. The Germans first faced KV tanks in the Battle of Rosenai, just after the start of Operation Barbarossa. 200 German tanks advancing through Lithuania on the 23rd of June encountered Soviet armor, including KV1 and KV2 tanks. Although their frontal armor was more than sufficient to deflect anti-tank fire, they were outflanked by German troops who would use explosive charges to destroy them or lure them to within point-blank range of direct fire artillery. 29 KVs were lost at Rosenai, of the more than 200 Soviet tanks lost in total. The strengths of the KVs included armor that could not be penetrated by any tank-mounted weapon then in service, except at point-blank range. It had good firepower, and it had good flotation on soft ground due to its wide tracks. Sadly, it also had some serious flaws. It was difficult to steer. The 20-year-old Holt Caterpillar design transmission was the main stumbling block of the KV1, and there is a ring of truth to some of the rumors of Soviet drivers using a hand sledgehammer to shift gears. And the ergonomics were poor, with limited visibility, and simply, at 45 tons, the tank was too heavy. Its weight severely impacted the maneuverability through the inability to cross many bridges, which the medium tanks had no difficulty with. The KV outweighed most tanks of the era, being about twice as heavy as the heaviest German tank before the Tiger. With oblique armor and other improvements, and without improving engine power, the maneuverability problem worsened, resulting in later models of the KV tanks not being able to keep up with medium tanks and more trouble in difficult terrain. Apart from this, its firepower was not better than the T-34, and it took field reports from serious senior commanders and certified heroes who could be honest without the risk of punishment to reveal what a dog a KV-1 really was. I reckon that's not a good thing to be called a dog of a tank. By 1942, the KV's armor was no longer impenetrable, since the Germans were now using long-barreled 50 and 75mm guns in large quantities. This forced the Soviets to install oblique armor, which weighed the tank down even further. The KV-1's side, top and turret armor could also be penetrated by the high-velocity rounds of the Mark 101 30mm cannon, carried by German ground attack aircraft. The 76.2mm gun on the KV-1 was also criticized, since it was also carried by the smaller, faster and cheaper T-34 tanks. On top of that, after tests with a Tiger captured near Leningrad, it was determined that the frontal armor could not be easily penetrated by this gun. All this combined with more difficulty to manufacture in comparison to the T-34 meant that its advantages no longer outweighed its drawbacks. When production was shifted to the Ural Mountains, Tankograd complex, the KV-2 was dropped. It was impressive on paper, as a slow-moving bunker buster. it was nonetheless not as useful in the highly mobile fluid warfare of World War II. Because the turret was so heavy, crews faced difficulties to traverse it on uneven terrain. Finally, it was expensive to produce and only about 300 KV2s were made, all in 1940 and 1941, making it one of the rarest Soviet tanks. As the war dragged on, the KV-1 continued to get more armor, compensating the effectiveness of German anti-tank weapons. This culminated in the KV-1 Model 1942, or KV-1C as designated by the Germans, to have very heavy armor, but lacked improvements to the engine. Tankers complained that, although they were well protected, their mobility was poor, and they had no firepower advantage over the T-34 medium tank. As a response to the criticism, the KV-1S was developed, with thinner armor and a smaller, lower turret in order to reclaim some speed. The KV-1S also had a commander's cupola with all-round vision blocks, giving it a boost in visibility. A sophisticated planetary transmission was installed, which significantly increased the reliability and allowed use of a more efficient regenerative geared steering. Due to the reduced weight, it managed to achieve a top speed of 43.3 km per hour, making it more of a slow medium instead of a heavy tank. Over 1,300 models were built before production ended in 1943. One major factor was why they should build the KV tanks at all when the T-34 could seemingly do everything the KV could do, and much more cheaply. There was an attempt at up-arming the KV-1S with an 85mm S-31 gun, resulting in the KV-1S-85, but this was rejected, since it would mean that the tank would not have a dedicated commander, as the turret crew would be reduced to 2, unlike the 3-man crew in the turret of the T-34-85. Due to all this, the Soviet heavy tank program was close to cancellation in mid-1943, but with the appearance of the German Panther tank in the summer of 1943, the Red Army was convinced to make a serious upgrades to its tank force for the first time since 1941. Soviet tanks needed bigger guns to take on the growing number of Panthers and the few Tigers. A stopgap for this problem was the KV-85, which was a KV-1S with a new turret of the Object 237, more commonly known as the IAAS-85 or IAAS-1, which mounted the same 85mm D5T as the Su-85 and early versions of the T-34-85, which was not yet in production at the time. The 85mm was capable of penetrating the Tiger I from 1,000 meters, and the demand for the weapon slowed the production of the KV-85, and only 148 were built in the end. The KV-85 appeared on the front beginning in September 1943, and its production ended in December the same year. The IS-1 was accepted into service and produced in the autumn and winter of 1943 to 1944, and was sent to the front as of October 1943. The production of the IS-1 was halted in the spring of 1944 when the IS-2, or IS-122, entered full-scale production. The IAAS tank, named after the Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, was based on the KV-13. The Soviets tested the 100mm D-10 and 122mm D-25T guns for the IAAS tanks, and in the end, the D-25T 120mm gun was selected as the main armament. This was primarily because of the ready availability and the fact of its large high explosive shell when attacking German fortifications. The 122mm gun had a low rate of fire and a reduced amount of ammunition since it used 2-piece ammo, where a shell is loaded with a separate explosive charge. When compared to similar late German 7.5cm and 8.8cm guns, it was noticed that the 122mm armor-piercing shells had a lower muzzle velocity, but it was still able to penetrate the frontal armor of the Panther tank at 2,500 meters, and the HE shells had enough power to easily blow off the drive sprocket and track of the heaviest German tanks or self-propelled guns. The 85mm gun continued to see service with lighter vehicles as the Su-85 self-propelled gun and the T-34-85 medium tank. The strange thing is, the Soviets did not recognize the different production models of the KV tanks during the war. They were introduced after the war in military publications, however. These designations were not strict and mainly described leading changes, while other changes might be adapted earlier or later in specific production batches. Certain designations, such as the KV1A, were applied by the Germans during the war. The next part might be a bit boring, since we're going through all models based on the KV tank, but I thought it would be important enough to paint a clear picture of the importance of the KV series of tanks. The KV1 starts off with the Model 1939 as designated after the war. They were the first production models and prone to frequent breakdowns, but highly resistant to anti-tank weapons during the Winter War. It was armed with the 76mm L11 gun. Most of these tanks were lacking the whole machine gun, and about 141 were built. The Model 1940, or called KV1A by the Germans, used the F-32 76mm gun and featured a new mandolet. This was the main model during the German invasion. The Model 1940S Ekranami, or KV1E, was literally named Model 1940 with screens. It featured bolted-on oblique armor. The Model 1941, or KV1B, received 25 to 35mm of extra armor to the turret, hull front and sides. The turret was now cast instead of welded, and the tank received a longer barreled ZIS-5 gun. The Model 1942, KV1C, featured either a fully cast or a welded turret with thicker armor and was up-armored again, but this time was fitted with an improved engine and a ZIS-5 gun. The KV1S, the variant with higher top speed limit but less armor, it featured a new, smaller cast turret and was redesigned and a redesigned rear hull with a new planetary transmission. About 1,370 were built. The KV2, the heavy assault tank we all know and love, armed with the M10 152 howitzer. This vehicle was produced at the same time as the KV1. It was slower due to the heavy turret and gun and had a much bigger profile compared to the KV1. Those captured and used by the German army were known as Sturmpanzerkampfwagen KV2 765R. Only a few were produced due to its combat effectiveness, mainly due to the decreased speed. Because of the increase in turret weight, the turret traverse mechanisms could only work on level ground. T-150, an experimental vehicle, featured increased armor and a new 700 horsepower engine. It was also heavier at 51 tons. The turret had a cupola, but was in all other ways identical to the turret of the KV1. Only one production prototype was constructed in 1941, but was destroyed in the defense of Leningrad. KV3, another experimental design with an elongated chassis, 7 rollers per side. The first two designs, the Object 221 and Object 222, which were to be armed with an 85mm and F-32 76.2mm gun respectively, were cancelled. Object 223's hull was built and was tested with weights to simulate the new conical turret, which would house a 107mm ZIS-6 gun. The Object 223 had up to 120mm of sloped armor, and series production was intended to start in late 1941, but the German invasion halted these plans and the only prototype was destroyed. KV4 was a project for a super heavy tank with about 20 proposed designs, which were all cancelled due to the invasion. Different versions would have been between 85 and 110 tons. Its armor ranged from 120 to 190mm and was also to be armed with the ZIS-6 107mm gun like the KV3. Different variants had various secondary cannons, which could be a 45 or 76mm gun, machine guns, or flamethrowers, in addition to the main 107mm gun. The KV5, another cancelled project for the super heavy tank, also to be armed with the ZIS-6 in the large turret and with machine guns in small secondary turrets. Weight was estimated at about 100 tons, and the vehicle was to have 150 to 180mm of armor. Development began in June of 1941, but was cancelled during the siege of Leningrad, in which all developmental operations of the Kirov plant were halted. The project fell out of favor because of the more advanced heavy tank designs, and no prototypes were built. KV7 was an experimental self-propelled gun armed with 3 cannons, 2 45mm Model 1932.34 guns and one 76mm F-34 gun. The vehicle had 100mm of frontal armor. Only one unit was produced and tested in 1941. The KV7-2 was armed with 2 76mm F-34 cannons and only had about 85mm of frontal armor. These vehicles were not taken into service because they were found inadequate to fight other tanks due to the limited gun traverse of 15 degrees to either side, and due to the small caliber which would be unfit to engage combat with concrete bunkers. After the failure of the KV7, it was decided to put a 150mm gun in a casemate instead of 3 smaller guns. This led to the U-18 and was the next step from the KV7 project. The first experimental self-propelled gun armed with a 152 ML20 gun. A wooden mock-up was made, but the project was cancelled. This led to the next tank, the SU-152, the heavy assault gun based on the KV1S. The ML20S gun howitzer was mounted slightly to the right of center with a limited traverse of 12 degrees. S-51 was an experimental self-propelled gun project by the Graben Artillery Project Central Department, armed with a 203mm howitzer M1931B4 cannon in a KV1S hull. The vehicle had 75mm of frontal hull armor, 60 on its sides, and the roof, which could be removed to facilitate loading, was 30mm thick. It was estimated to weigh 66 tons, and one prototype passed by the testing grounds in the spring of 1944. But it was deemed not successful and was cancelled within a year. ZIG-20 was similar to the S-51, but it had 105mm of frontal armor and 75mm of side armor, with the ML20 152mm gun. The KV1 was already being phased out when a wooden mock-up was constructed. The SU-203 was a proposed project based on the design of the SU-152 with a 203mm M4 mortar, but was never built. KV-8, KV-8S and KV-8M were flamethrower tanks. The KV-8 was based on the KV-1 with an ATO-41 flamethrower in the turret, besides a machine gun. To accommodate the new weapon, the 76.2mm gun was replaced with a smaller 45mm gun, though they disguised it with a 76mm tube over the 45mm gun to look like the 76mm weapon. The KV-8S was based on the KV-1S, equipped with the improved ATO-42 flamethrower. The KV-8M was the upgraded version of the KV-8S with 2 flamethrowers. 2 prototypes were constructed. The KV-9 was a prototype with the short 122mm U-11 howitzer. The KV-10 was also known as the KV-1K, which fitted 4 rocket launchers on the sides of the hull, and each launcher contained 2 132mm M13 rockets. An early version of the KV-1K had 2 launchers on the back of the hull, with each containing 6 rockets. One prototype was constructed and tested in 1942, but not taken into service. The KV-11 was armed with the 85mm F-30 cannon, but never built. The KV-12 was an experimental chemical tank, equipped with 4 chemical toxin tanks on the back. The tanks were surrounded by 30mm of armor, and, seriously, not taken into service. The KV-13 was a prototype for a medium tank. It was designated for an advanced redesign of the KV series, which resulted in the production of the IAAS series. KV-85, KV-85G, KV-100, KV-122 and KV-152 are all based on the KV-1S, with a new turret with the 85mm, 100, 122 and 152mm guns respectively. The ball mount hull machine gun was removed and the hull was welded shut. 148 tanks of the KV-85 were made in the second half of 1943 until the spring of 1944. The 85G was fitted with an 85mm S-31 gun opposed to the D5T. This was a competitor to the KV-85 and lost the competition. Of the KV100 and 122, only a prototype was made and never taken into service. The KV152 was only proposed, but nothing became of the project. The KV220 was another experimental project of the KV1 with a longer chassis, just like the KV4 with 7 rolls per side. It had 100mm of armor, a new 850 horsepower engine with turbocharging. It had a diamond-shaped turret with an 85mm F-30 cannon. One prototype was constructed in 1941 and was lost in December of the same year after a direct hit to the frontal hull by a 150mm howitzer, Selbstfahrhowitzer 18. Now we're finally done with all those experimental tanks, and believe me, those were a lot. And now we're going on to a little bit of combat history, combat service of the KV tank. And as mentioned earlier in the episode, we're looking at the Battle of the Rhizheny, where a KV1 or a KV2 advanced far behind the German lines after attacking a column of German trucks. General Erhard Raus, commander of the 6th Panzer Division's Kampfgruppe, described the vehicle as a KV1, and as he was the commander of the unit delayed by the vehicle, it seems to be the most reliable source. The tank stopped on a road across soft ground and was engaged by 4 50mm anti-tank guns of the 6th Panzer Division's anti-tank gun battalion. Although the KV-1 was hit multiple times, it fired back and knocked them out. An 88mm flak gun was brought in by the anti-aircraft battalion of the 6th Division and was placed at about 700 meters behind the tank. But again, the KV-1 knocked the gun out before it could score a hit. In the following night, German combat engineers tried to destroy the KV-1 with satchel charges, but despite possibly damaging the tracks, they were unable to. Early the next morning, German tanks opened fire from the woodland, while an 88mm was set up behind the tank. While the crew of the KV-1 was distracted by a Panzer 35T, the Germans were able to score several hits, of which a couple penetrated. German infantry then closed in while under fire from the KV-1's machine guns. It seemed that the KV-1's crew had already been knocked out before they moved in, but with the machine guns opening up on the advancing units, it is likely that they were merely stunned by the cannon fire. The German infantry pushed grenades through 2 penetrations made by the 88mm and the hatches, which finally ended the tank's resistance. According to some accounts, the crew was buried by the German soldiers with full military honors, and on other accounts, the crew escaped during the night. I honestly don't know which I would believe more, but I hope, for the crew's sake, that the latter is true. Some KVs remained in service up to the end of the war, although in diminishing numbers, since they would wear out or get knocked out by enemy forces. A number of 1942 vintage KV-1s was operated by the 260th Guards Heavy Breakthrough Tank Regiment, based on the Leningrad front, to at least as late as the summer of 1944. Before being re-equipped with IAAS model tanks. A regiment of KVs saw service in Manchuria in August 1945, and a few KV-85s were used in Crimea in the summer of 1944. 2 KVs, nicknamed Klimi, were used by Finnish forces, a Model 19 and a Model 1941, which both received minor upgrades and both survived the war. Romanian forces captured 1 KV-1 in November 1942, and 1 more in March of 1944. We looked at the turbulent combat service of the KV tank, an impenetrable colossus when Germany invaded, but nearly useless during the end. A nuisance for sure, but eventually phased out for newer, better tanks. I hope you enjoyed this episode of General History Talks, and if you did, please consider liking the video, share it, and subscribe to my channel. If you would like, you can leave a comment with a new subject for a later video, and I will consider it. Until the next time, take care.